Hi everyone, and today we will be going over the facts on gateway drugs and also talking about the prevention terms that every substance abuse prevention specialist needs to know. Okay, first let's talk about the different names for certain drugs, especially the street names. So some of the drugs that we'll talk about in this class include marijuana, heroin, and methamphetamines, and so there are a lot of different types of street name drugs, and there's new ones coming out every day that I haven't even heard of. And so go ahead and take a look at some of those and think about what are some of the other names that you have heard about specific names for certain drugs. So we want to kind of talk about what is the theory behind gateway drugs. And the gateway theory has actually been studied since the 70s, and it's best described as the stepping stone hypothesis, which is basically the idea that if you use one type of drug, then you have a greater likelihood or probability of consuming another type of drug or a more harmful drug later in life. It is typically primarily focused on the adolescent early experimentation stage and then escalates into this addictive illicit drug use in young adulthood. Do you think that using something like alcohol or marijuana as an adolescent puts you at a higher risk for using something like heroin or cocaine when you're older? So there are two assumptions of why this theory exists, and that there are gateway substances that can lead to harder drugs. One is the idea of experimentation. Trying a drug like marijuana increases that taste and the perceived pleasure within your brain reward system for other drugs, which associates with the same feeling that you get from other drugs. The second reason why gateway drug theory exists is the idea of social groups. Someone who uses a specific kind of drug, even if it's just alcohol or marijuana, they're more likely to be surrounded by other people who are using harder drugs, or they have more access to it. So think about if they have a drug deal for marijuana, then they might also be able to get access to harder drugs later on. So that also increases the theory's acceptability. This theory does assume a linear sequence of stages, beginning with the socially acceptable drugs like marijuana, alcohol, or even cigarettes, and then possibly proceeding into harder drugs like heroin, cocaine, things like that. However, there has been research that has stated that this theory doesn't make sense because a large percentage of people who have used marijuana and alcohol do not continue on to harder drugs. So prevention specialists search for ways to prevent using drugs, using gateway drugs to prevent them from ever entering those later stages and trying harder drugs. Or do we need to look at the factors that possibly prevent those who use gateway drugs to not participate in the harder drug use? Now, I do want to be very clear, using a gateway drug like alcohol and marijuana does not mean that it will automatically lead to the use of harder drugs. Correlation does not equal causation. So there are many other risk factors associated that allow the experimentation of drugs to possibly lead to a harder and more harmful type of drug. The use of alcohol and tobacco does not automatically guarantee the use of marijuana or other illegal drugs. However, for those who have used marijuana and other hard drugs, it is extremely rare for them to have not used alcohol or tobacco first. So these are some of the gateway drugs used most commonly that can increase the susceptibility to use in other harder drugs. So one is nicotine. It is found that tobacco and nicotine increase the brain's susceptibility to other illicit drugs, and that this is based off the epidemiological evidence that the most illicit drug users report using tobacco products. Another one is alcohol. So alcohol, the individuals who use alcohol often are led to using tobacco and marijuana or other substances as well, and that prevention specialists may need to focus more on preventing alcohol if they want to prevent tobacco and other substances. Now, marijuana also affects the dopamine reward centers in your brain, which can increase a vulnerability to drug abuse or addiction and other substances. And inhalants, due to their availability, might provide an increased use before illicit drugs become available. Now, with the opioid epidemic, we're starting to see prescription drug abuse as another gateway drug. So specifically those painkillers or opiates that are prevalent in the media. There is research to show that those who have become addicted to prescription opiates like oxycodone or hydrocodone are more likely to switch to heroin. However, this gateway drug is not just impacting adolescents, but it's also impacting adults. So here we have the most common gateway drugs: alcohol, marijuana, and now prescription medicines. Now, we are learning that not everyone who uses these drugs are going to eventually become addicted or even move on to harder substances. But here are some of the risk factors that might increase that likelihood. One is if their environment has an acceptability to drugs, so it's more normalized for them to use drugs in their environment. If they have different generations in their family, close parents or close siblings that are using drugs or have a history of addiction. They have a history of drug abuse from something else. If they have mental disorders like depression, anxiety, bipolar, they might seek out one of these gateway drugs in order to cope with that mental disability. And then if they have a social life that frequents drug use. So we've talked about the possibility that one of the reasons the gateway theory is there is that you have access to other drugs because the people that you are around are also using drugs. But the biggest risk factor for subsequent addiction or illicit drug use on harder drugs is the age in which these drugs are used. So these gateway drugs like alcohol, marijuana, and prescription drugs, the younger you are that you experiment with those, the more likely you are to participate in harder drug use. So really, the type of drug is not as important as the age in which you first use it. For example, kids who first drink in 6th and 7th grade went on to have an average of using 2 other illicit substances later, while kids who waited until 12th grade to drink on average tried 0.4 substances. So we can see a larger difference in those who started drinking at a young age, then they were more likely to participate in harder drug use. There is some research also on tobacco, and one research talked about how smokers were 3 times more likely to drink alcohol, they were 7 times more likely to use smokeless tobacco, and they were 10 to 30 times more likely to use other illicit drugs than non-smoker individuals. The other gateway drug, alcohol, can be seen as just as addictive and dangerous as any other illicit substance. And again, going back to the earlier that a young adult starts using alcohol, the more likely they are to abuse other substances. And the use of alcohol has led to the use of marijuana, tobacco, and illicit drugs in individuals. In fact, there was one study that said those who used alcohol were 16 times more likely to use marijuana or other narcotics. It's safe to say that prevention specialists can improve by delaying the onset of alcohol use in adolescents. Now, there is a huge debate on marijuana and its positive and negative impacts to this date, but research has also found that marijuana often precedes the use of harder drugs. The earlier the age of experimentation with marijuana, the more likely that there will be a drug abuse development in other hard drugs. Now, whether you believe that marijuana is harmless or not, and that it does have some benefits, it's important to recognize that having other risk factors like we've talked about using marijuana puts you at a higher risk for using other illicit drugs. So again, it doesn't mean that just because you smoke marijuana that you're going to eventually do heroin. However, if you have a risk factor like using at a young age or having a mental illness, then it does put you at a higher risk to possibly do a drug similar to heroin. The other thought, going back to that social idea, is the perception that because marijuana is illegal in most states, the idea that you're willing to do a criminal behavior like using a substance that is illegal, then that might change your perception and your attitude towards using other drugs that are illegal. So some people argue that the mere act of buying marijuana is more of a gateway drug than the actual substance. And again, now you have interaction with the drug dealer that might also have access to harder drugs. Those who are regular users of marijuana are 3 times more likely to be addicted to a substance like heroin. So prescription drug medication and abuse is on the rise right now as we see this opiate epidemic. And the most common prescription drugs abused are opiates, oxycontins, stimulants for ADHD like Adderall, or depressants for anxiety like Xanax. Painkillers with opiates actually have a component of what is in heroin, which is why you see a lot of people who are addicted to prescription medication switching over to heroin because of the accessibility. Because of this, it's become one of the most severe drug epidemics in the U.S. history. Prescription drugs are the most abused drugs after alcohol and marijuana in the U.S. Opiate prescriptions become very physically dependent, and when they no longer get them, this is why you see people go out and seek out heroin, because it gives them a similar buzzed feeling, but they have easier access to it. So I do want to briefly go over the different schedule of classifications of drugs. And so the schedule of classification is specifically for the FDA of how they determine the legality of drugs and how easily accessible they should be. And so there are 5 distinct areas, and they depend on the drug's acceptable medical use and the potential for dependency. However, you'll notice through that some of these drugs obviously aren't going based off of research, and it might just be going based off of the penalization of criminals instead of what science actually says about the potential for abuse. So the first schedule would be Schedule 1, and it is characterized by having the highest abuse potential, that there is no medical use for it, and that it is not available for prescription. So that means that these are the types of drugs that you will get criminalized for because of this. Now you'll see that I have listed here as the ones that meet Schedule 1 drug include heroin, LSD, Quaaludes, and marijuana, which we do know that marijuana is starting to become legal in many different states because they're noticing that it doesn't have a high abuse potential, and they are finding some research for medical use purposes. But at the moment, the government has not changed its schedule. Schedule 2 drugs also have a high abuse potential, but they have some limited medical use, and so you can get them available from prescriptions. Now, these are going to include those painkillers like morphine. It's going to include cocaine, meth, and methadone, and then Adderall and Ritalin. So you will find certain medicines like NMF, and so that's why they will have a prescription for them. Okay, the third classification has a moderate abuse potential. They all have some kind of medical use, and they are also only available by prescription. That includes barbiturates, non-narcotic analgesics, and anabolic steroids. And so the Schedule 4 drugs have a low abuse potential, have medical use, and again are also available by prescription, and that includes drugs like Valium or Librium. So those might be like the antidepressants and stuff. The Schedule 5 drugs have a low abuse potential and medical use. The prescription is not required, and the sale of these medicines must be recorded. This includes cough medicines with codeine or antidiarrheals. Cough medicine has to be recorded because it is a substance used in methamphetamines. So they have to keep track of that. Well, that is the end of this lecture. I hope you've learned a little bit about the classification of drugs, and I hope you've learned a little bit about the pros and cons of the gateway theory and how to implement this, or how we can use this as prevention specialists.